Alright, so I did really quick want to go over how to sort of patch up a print if it layer shifted and failed halfway through. So in this case, I was working on this weird sort of helmet thing that I made as a strange personal project, and it failed after about 24 hours of printing and used about zero point 0.5 kilograms of plastic. And I was like, I really don't want to redo that. It feels like a waste of time, waste of plastic. So what you want to do if this ever happens, if you're able to separate the layer shifted part from your original print, you want to figure out as close as possible where it broke, and then basically go back into your original model and cut it at that point. So you should be left with two pieces, basically one that's the part that's already printed, and one that is the part that you still need to print. So reslice the bit that you still need to print, and reprint it. Once that's done, you're just gonna hope that you cut it in a reasonable place and that the model pieces fit back together. In this case, they were a little bit off, but just glue them back together. And in this case, my process is similar for most things I do, but this was kind of thin model. It was 2.4 millimeter wall thickness. So what I decided to do is just take some of my super runny super glue, which I love this stuff, dollar store super glue, it's great. And I used a few drips of glue just around the model to sort of hold things together. And I let that dry, and then I came back in and I dripped more super glue into the rest of the seams. Again, with the super runny stuff, just goes right between the seams and sticks everything together really nicely. And the reason that I did this for this particular model, I've had to separate pieces that I glued together improperly, and it was awful. So now I'm like, alright, I'd rather just tack it together with a few pieces. It's going to make it easier to handle in the future when adding the rest of the glue, and also if I screw up the first time, it's easier to remove 2 drops worth of super glue than it is an entire seam filled with the stuff. So it is partly just paranoia on my part. You can also use Accelerator to speed this process, which will pretty much dry the super glue instantly. In this case, the model actually sat perfectly straight, and it was really easy to just sit the piece on top and just let it sit there for a few hours to cure. So I did that. I wasn't pressed for time. And the Accelerator is like a little bit expensive, and again, I just kind of like, I don't know, if you don't need to use it, and don't use it. So like I mentioned before, I did cut the print in grossly the wrong spot. There's huge gaps and seams on pretty much all of the cheeks around that seam that I did. So I grabbed my Durham's Rock Hard Water Putty, or whatever the heck it's called. It's basically like super cheap wood filler, but it's really, really strong, and it just mixes with water, and you can make it whatever consistency you want, which to me is like really nice and flexible. It has a reasonable working time. Dries pretty fast, like usually within a few hours. The only negative, every once in a while I have it fall off a print. It'll like flake off, but I feel like that's usually if I like put it on and don't apply it properly, or like try to do stuff to it while it's wet. But it has happened on occasion. But anywho, so I just went on and did a really, really thick globby layer of Durham's on the seam to sort of do a preliminary evening of that surface. Once that was dry, I went back with my Dremel, just using the most randomly abrasive cutting tip I could find, and I sort of did like a preliminary smoothing of that seam. And I actually cut into the plastic of the print a little bit deliberately, because it's a pretty bad gap. So I was like, what if I just shave some of this plastic off instead of trying to patch like a 1/4 inch lump in this cheek. So I did that. I also actually did a coat of Durham's over the supports on the top of the model. I had left them on, they were just being really annoying to pick off, and I decided it would be easier to just cover them entirely. So I did that as well. But after that first sort of Durham's and then sanding, I went back with 2 more layers of Durham's. So I did a another really thick layer, and that pretty much filled in any of the remaining gaps that I had. And then I went back while that was still wet, and I did a thin layer of Durham's. Fairly watered down, fairly liquidy. And what this did is it just sort of filled like micro gaps, but also the extra moisture in that batch helped to smooth some of the maybe rougher patches in the thicker coat, which again is kind of nice about Durham's because it's water soluble, so you do have a little bit of flexibility. You can go back and sort of like paint it smooth a little bit with a paintbrush to reduce sanding time in the future. So I did that, let it dry, and then sanded the crap out of the whole thing. Again, for realsies this time, I just used 120 grit sandpaper and then sanded everything pretty much as smooth as I could get it. I did go back with a Dremel and reach some of the areas that were a little hard to get by hand, like the inside of the nostrils, some of the areas on the inside of the face. I also hit like some of the eyes and stuff, mostly just for touch-ups. At that point, I hit it with spray primer. I tried the Duplicolor Red for the first time, and it kind of looked like tomato soup, which was weird. And once that was dry, I pretty much called it done. There's definitely still some little bumps and lumps and divots on the model, but in this case I'll be painting with oil paint, so I don't really care, because that's going to go in and kind of fill out or cover any of the blemishes. But normally what you would do is, like, once you hit it with filler primer that first time, go back with whatever spot putty you're using, fill in more gaps, sand down anything that needs to be sanded, hit it with another coat of filler primer, and repeat for eternity until you're happy. But yeah, in this case, like I said, I'm just going to call this one done for now until I paint the thing, and that's going to be a whole terrifying, probably several hour long experience. But yeah, that's what I did for this.